Hi everyone, my name is Suhani Desai, and this presentation is about the Apollo program. Also, this channel is part of a non-profit organization called One World, One Nation that strives to support children globally who lack educational resources or are disadvantaged. By providing these students with an extended learning platform, they can explore their interests, build on their passions, and find a path to a career. Please subscribe to this channel and like this video to support our initiative. The information for our organization is in the description box below. The Apollo program was a series of missions that ultimately led to humans landing on the moon. But why was the Apollo program created? Well, in 1961, President John F. Kennedy gave a speech about the need to explore space. In his speech, he said that mankind would land on the moon by the end of the 1960s. NASA in turn created the Apollo program and reached the moon in 1969. There were a total of 15 missions in the Apollo program. Some of the missions led to catastrophic failure, while others led to success. In this video, we'll discuss all 15 of them, including information about the purpose, the outcome, and what was learned as a result of the mission. First, we have Apollo 1. Apollo 1 is known as a tragedy and did not succeed. Apollo 1 was to be the first manned mission in the program. It was supposed to launch on February 21, 1967, but during a test, the launch vehicle, AS-204, caught fire in the command module. The three astronauts that were scheduled to launch that mission were on the command module at the time and died in the fire. As a result of the fire, the next launch vehicle contained a lunar module rather than a launch module. No flights were ever designated as Apollo 2 or 3, so the next Apollo mission was Apollo 4. Apollo 4 was an unmanned mission, meaning that the spacecraft was controlled remotely without a crew on board. It lifted off on November 9, 1967. It was the first test flight of the Saturn V rocket and was also the first to launch from the Kennedy Space Center. The mission simulated a trip to the moon and back, which was important because it allowed NASA to see what systems worked and which ones needed improvement. Apollo 4 had a successful entry, and after the tragedy of Apollo 1, it brought confidence and hope of a manned mission to the moon. On January 22, 1968, Apollo 5 launched. Its purpose was to test the lunar module and the SIVB stage instrument performance. The lunar module was a component that would land on the moon, and it's where the astronauts would live while on the moon. The SIVB stage instrument was attached to the third stage of the rocket, or the third section of it. Its purpose was to change the position or orientation of the spacecraft once it was in space. The mission was successful and accomplished its main goal. Apollo 6 was a less successful mission. It launched on April 4, 1968, and its whole flight was a total of 9 hours and 57 minutes long. In the first few minutes after takeoff, the pogo effect took place. The pogo effect is a series of vertical oscillations, meaning up and down movement, hence the name pogo effect. In this situation, the pogo effect took place for 30 seconds. Fortunately, it did not cause too much damage. Later into the flight, 2 engines turned off before they were supposed to. Even later, the third stage of the rocket never started. Through attempted rescue efforts, so much fuel was used up that there was not enough for the second burn. As a result, Apollo 6 did not reach the designated speed for reentry and landed in the Pacific Ocean. It's currently on display at the Fernbanks Science Center in Atlanta, Georgia. Apollo 7 was a manned mission that launched on October 11, 1968. Its objective was to test a variety of systems with an actual crew. The crew for Apollo 7 consisted of Don F. Iseal, Walter M. Schirra Jr., and Walter Cunningham. After launching, the spacecraft experienced minor problems, but the crew was able to fix them manually. In addition, the astronauts aboard experienced a cold, which made the spaceflight miserable. That's because the mucus gathered and was unable to drain. Upon re-entry, they chose not to wear helmets to lower the risk of their eardrums bursting. Apollo 7 showed that all of the systems worked very well on a real mission, and it also helped to set up future missions. Apollo 8 was another manned mission, and it launched on December 21, 1968. Its objective was to orbit the moon for the first time. It was a successful mission, resulting in the famous image known as Earthrise. The mission took place during Christmas, so the astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders read the first 10 verses of Genesis. Apollo 8 was the first time that humans had ever visited the moon and came back safely. Apollo 9 launched on March 3, 1969. It was a manned mission with astronauts James McDivitt, David Scott, and Russell Schweickart. The main goal of Apollo 9 was to test out the lunar module with the crew. Everything worked according to plan, and the lunar module was shown to be effective. Apollo 9 became the first mission to dock the lunar module. One minor incident was that re-entry was delayed by a little bit due to rough seas in the landing area. But overall, it was a successful mission. On May 18, 1969, Apollo 10 launched. Its crew was Thomas P. Stafford, John W. Young, and Eugene A. Cernan, and its objective was to simulate a moon landing without actually landing on the moon. The launch was really successful, so only one mid-flight correction was needed. A mid-flight correction is often needed to reposition the spacecraft once it's in space. The new position allows for a corrected trajectory for where the spacecraft is supposed to end up. The position is corrected with the use of thrusters that burn to push the spacecraft into the corrected trajectory. Apollo 10 was able to complete their mission by coming within 9 miles of the moon's surface before returning back to Earth. Apollo 11 is one of the most famous Apollo missions. It launched on July 16, 1969, with a crew of Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. Its main goal was to put humans on the moon, and it did just that. While on the surface of the moon, Neil Armstrong said his famous line, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The astronauts collected samples and left behind medallions for the Apollo 1 astronauts who had died in the fire, and for 2 cosmonauts who had also died. This mission proved that other missions had been worth the effort and showed just what humanity could accomplish. Apollo 12 launched on November 14, 1969. Its purpose was mainly to explore the moon and take scientific equipment to the moon. Taking scientific equipment to the moon allowed NASA to learn more information about the makeup and history of the moon. In the case of Apollo 12, they brought equipment to measure seismic data. It was successful, although contact was lost very briefly in the beginning stages of flight. The crew aboard Apollo 12 was Charles Conrad Jr., Alan L. Bean, and Richard F. Gordon Jr. It was a 10-day flight, and it landed in the Pacific Ocean upon re-entry. Apollo 13 launched on April 11, 1970. The crew consisted of James A. Lovell Jr., Fred Hayes Jr., and John L. Swigert Jr. The mission was aborted due to a series of problems. It started with a problem with one of the oxygen tanks. The tank exploded, which led to the other tank failing as well. The command module then lost electricity, light, and water. Afterwards, it lost 2 of the 3 fuel cells which powered the spacecraft. They then learned that they were losing oxygen and that it was going into space. The crew ended up staying in the lunar module lifeboat. They had enough oxygen, but they were concerned about power. They had to decrease their power consumption so they could have enough power to return to Earth. They decreased their power consumption by shutting off unnecessary equipment and by staying in the lunar module. Another concern was water. They needed water both to drink but also to cool the spacecraft. The astronauts each only had 6 ounces of water a day. In total, the astronauts ended up losing 31.5 pounds. A third concern of theirs was carbon dioxide removal. The lithium hydroxide canisters that they had to remove carbon dioxide did not work in the lunar module. As a result, they had to attach them using plastic bags, cardboard, and tape. Eventually, they landed in the Pacific Ocean with all members of the crew alive. Although the mission was aborted, it allowed NASA to gain insight into how to save a crew in space. An interesting fact about Apollo 13 is that there's a movie about the events of this failed mission. Apollo 14 launched on January 31, 1971. Astronauts aboard were Alan B. Shepard Jr., Edgar D. Mitchell, and Stuart A. Russo. Apollo 14 had the same primary mission as Apollo 13 because Apollo 13 was unable to complete its mission. Astronauts aboard Apollo 14 collected and brought back to Earth 94 pounds of rocks and soil. When brought back to Earth, rocks and soil from the moon allow scientists to test the composition of the moon and complete other scientific experiments. The collections were used by 187 scientific teams in the United States and by 14 other countries. Apollo 15 launched on July 26, 1971. It was a lot like Apollo 14 in its mission objectives. It was for carrying out further scientific experiments and collecting further samples. It also created a number of records, one of which is the first time a car was driven on the moon. Another record was that during Apollo 15, the first deep space EVA occurred. An important thing to note is that a car driven in space is very different than a car driven on Earth. Although they share the same primary objective, a lot of the materials used in normal cars wouldn't work on the moon. There's no atmosphere on the moon and it's extremely cold, whereas on Earth we have an atmosphere and a variety of temperatures, much warmer than on the moon. Additionally, normal cars can be quite heavy, and in a spacecraft it's best to have the least amount of weight. Therefore, NASA had to create a car that would meet this criteria, resulting in the car seen in the picture above. Apollo 16 launched on April 16, 1972. It was a lot like Apollo 14 and Apollo 15. It was also successful and also was about completing scientific experiments and collecting samples. The astronauts aboard Apollo 16 were John W. Young, Charles M. Duke Jr., and Thomas Mattingly II. Apollo 17 was the last Apollo mission. It launched on December 7, 1972, and its crew consisted of Eugene A. Cernan, Harrison H. Smith, and Ronald E. Evans. Its purpose was also to conduct a variety of scientific tests, including biomedical tests. Biomedical tests are important because they show scientists how the human body reacts when it's in space. Apollo 17 was the last Apollo mission because by then the public was no longer interested. Since NASA is a government program, they rely on funding. They get more or less funding depending on the projects that they're doing and whether or not people are interested. Currently, NASA is planning another mission to the moon that will put the next man and the first woman on the moon. In conclusion, the Apollo missions helped mankind to gain so much knowledge about space and the moon. Beyond that, it allowed humans to go to the moon. It showed that when people have a goal, they accomplish it. Going back to President Kennedy's speech, NASA did gain the knowledge and experiences that he tasked them with. It just goes to show that if we have a goal, then we can make it happen. Perseverance and hard work.